scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. Peppa always brushed her teeth before bed, but tonight something was different about the bathroom mirror. Her reflection seemed to lag behind her movements, creating a disorienting effect that made her feel dizzy. When she raised her toothbrush, her reflection waited a full second before doing the same. When she smiled, her reflection frowned. When she waved, her reflection turned away. Peppa tried to ignore it and continue brushing her teeth, but the reflection began to act independently, brushing its teeth with movements that didn't match her own. The reflection Peppa opened her mouth wide, revealing teeth that were too sharp and too numerous, filling her mouth like a shark's. Real Peppa dropped her toothbrush in shock, but reflection Peppa continued brushing with mechanical precision. The reflection began to mouth words that Peppa couldn't hear, its lips moving urgently as if trying to warn her about something. Suddenly, the reflection pressed its hands against the glass from the inside, and Peppa could see that its fingers were too long, with nails that had grown into claws. The reflection began to push harder against the mirror, and cracks started to appear in the glass, spreading outward from where its hands pressed. As the cracks grew larger, Peppa could hear muffled sounds coming from the other side of the mirror, sounds like crying, like screaming, like someone trapped and desperate to escape. The reflection Peppa's mouth opened wider and wider until it seemed to take up most of its face, and from that impossible mouth came a sound like breaking glass mixed with her own voice calling for help. The mirror finally shattered, but instead of glass falling to the floor, the pieces hung in the air, each one showing a different reflection of Peppa, all of them wrong in their own terrifying way. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. Peppa woke up thirsty in the middle of the night and went downstairs to the kitchen for a glass of water. The house was dark and quiet, with only the soft hum of the refrigerator breaking the silence. As she reached for a glass, she noticed that all the kitchen appliances were on, their displays glowing in the darkness, but she was certain they had been turned off before bedtime. The microwave showed midnight but was running anyway, its turntable spinning endlessly. The oven was preheating to a temperature that didn't exist on its dial, and the dishwasher was running a cycle that seemed to go on forever. When she opened the refrigerator for water, she found it completely empty except for a single plate covered with a silver dome. Despite knowing she shouldn't, Peppa lifted the dome and found a birthday cake with candles that lit themselves as she watched. The cake was decorated with a message written in frosting that read, "Happy birthday, Peppa." But today wasn't her birthday, and the handwriting looked like her own. As she stared at the cake, the candles began to multiply, covering the entire surface until the cake was more flame than food. The kitchen filled with the sound of children singing "Happy Birthday," but the voices were coming from inside the walls, muffled and distorted. The singing grew louder and more discordant, and Peppa realized that the voices belonged to children who sounded exactly like her, all singing at slightly different speeds. The cake began to melt from the heat of the countless candles, but instead of frosting and cake, thick red liquid pooled on the plate. The singing stopped abruptly, and in the sudden silence, Peppa heard her own voice whisper from behind her, "Make a wish." Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. Peppa was taking a bath, splashing happily in the bubbles. Suddenly, the water turned murky, then black, and the bubbles began to pop with a sinister hiss. She tried to get out, but her hands slipped on the porcelain, as if the tub itself was holding her captive. A pair of glowing red eyes emerged from the black water, followed by a shadowy, elongated figure. It reached out with a long skeletal hand, its fingers tipped with sharp, black claws. "Pause 30 seconds, Peppa screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the gurgling of the drain, which had transformed into a gaping maw. The figure pulled her deeper into the black water, its cold embrace tightening around her. She could hear faint whispers coming from the water, calling her name, inviting her to join its watery grave. The bathroom grew colder, and the shadows danced around her, making the distorted figure seem to come alive. She closed her eyes, wishing it was all a dream, but the cold touch on her cheek told her it was terrifyingly real. Pause 30 seconds. When she opened them again, the water was clear, and the figure was gone, but her reflection in the mirror was not her own. It was the shadowy figure, its glowing red eyes staring back at her, a sinister smile on its face. She knew she was trapped. The house creaked and groaned around her, each sound a chilling reminder of the presence lurking within. She could hear faint whispers, carried on the wind, calling her name. The air grew heavy, and a strange, sweet smell filled the room, making her dizzy. She felt a cold touch on her ankle, and a shiver ran down her spine. Peppa knew she wasn't alone. Pause 30 seconds. The shadows in her room seemed to deepen, twisting into grotesque shapes. She could feel eyes watching her from every corner. The house was no longer a safe haven, but a trap. She pulled the covers over her head, but the whispers grew louder, more insistent. She knew she had to escape, but where could she go? The house was alive and it wanted her. She could hear the floorboards groaning, the walls creaking, as if the house itself was closing in on her. The air was thick with an unseen presence, and she felt a suffocating weight on her chest. Peppa knew this was the end. The last thing she saw before darkness consumed her was her own reflection, now completely transformed, its glowing red eyes staring back at her. It was smiling, and then nothing, just the silence of the house, waiting for its next victim. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. Mummy Pig was preparing dinner, but the food on the table began to move on its own. The carrots wriggled like worms, the potatoes pulsed with a faint, internal light, and the peas rolled off the plate and scurried across the floor like tiny, green insects. The familiar aroma of cooking was replaced by a strange, earthy smell, mixed with something sweet and sickly. Peppa and George watched in horror as the vegetables began to coalesce, forming a grotesque, pulsating mass in the center of the table. It grew larger, slowly taking on a vaguely humanoid shape, with two glowing green eyes emerging from its surface. Mummy Pig, her back turned, continued to hum, oblivious to the monstrous transformation occurring behind her. The kitchen grew cold, and the familiar sounds of cooking were replaced by a faint, squelching noise. The monstrous vegetable creature began to twitch, then to rise, its form dripping with a viscous, green liquid. It let out a low, guttural groan, a sound that vibrated through the floorboards. The kitchen, once a place of nourishment, was now a scene of unimaginable horror. The familiar comfort of their home was replaced by a chilling sense of dread, as the food they were about to eat transformed into a living nightmare. The creature took a step, its root-like feet squelching on the tiled floor. It reached out a tendril, its glowing eyes fixed on Peppa. The house was no longer safe, for a monstrous hunger had awakened within its walls. The familiar comfort of their dinner time had become a terrifying encounter with a sentient, malevolent entity. The food was alive and it was hungry. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. In the quiet of the night, Peppa was awakened by a strange scratching sound coming from inside her wardrobe. She tried to ignore it, pulling the covers tighter around her. But the scratching grew louder, more insistent. It was a rhythmic, deliberate sound, like claws on wood. A thin sliver of light appeared under the wardrobe door, pulsing with a sickly green glow. Peppa's heart hammered against her ribs. She wanted to call for Mummy and Daddy Pig, but her voice was caught in her throat. The wardrobe door creaked open, and a long, spindly shadow stretched across the floor, reaching for her bed. The air in the room grew cold, and the familiar, cheerful wallpaper seemed to peel away, revealing dark, damp stone beneath. The green light spilled out, casting dancing, distorted shadows on the walls. The scratching stopped, replaced by a low, guttural growl. Peppa could see two glowing red eyes in the darkness of the wardrobe, unblinking and malevolent. The shadow on the floor grew larger, taking the shape of a monstrous figure with long, sharp claws. The smell of damp earth and decay filled the room. The figure stepped out of the wardrobe, its form shifting and indistinct, a creature of nightmare. It moved with a slow, deliberate grace, its red eyes fixed on Peppa. The familiar comfort of her bedroom had become a cage, and the monster was the keeper. The moonlight streaming through the window was swallowed by the encroaching darkness. The creature's growl rumbled through the room, a sound that vibrated in Peppa's very bones. It raised a clawed hand, its shadow falling over Peppa's bed. The world outside her window seemed to fade away, leaving only the suffocating darkness of the room and the terrifying presence of the monster. The last thing Peppa saw before she squeezed her eyes shut was the glint of sharp, white teeth in the monster's gaping maw. The scary Peppa Pig episode that never aired. It was bedtime, but Peppa couldn't sleep. Strange sounds came from downstairs. At first, it seemed like her family was still awake, talking quietly. But when she listened carefully, the voices didn't sound right. Peppa tiptoed downstairs and peeked into the living room. Her family was there, standing motionless in a circle, facing each other. They weren't talking, but she could still hear voices. The same voices, but coming from somewhere else, as if delayed. Mummy Pig, Daddy Pig, and George stood with eyes closed, mouths moving silently. The real voices seemed to come from the walls, the ceiling, everywhere except from the people themselves. The voices had a normal family conversation about tomorrow's plans, but the words felt empty. Peppa crept back to her room, but the strange sounds continued. Now she heard footsteps walking through the house, but when she looked out the window, her family was still standing in the same circle. The footsteps repeated the same path over and over: kitchen to living room, up the stairs, down the hallway, and back. The footsteps stopped outside her bedroom door. Peppa held her breath. Someone was breathing behind the door, but too quietly to be any family member. The breathing was slow and patient, as if whoever it was had all the time in the world. Peppa whispered, "Mummy." No answer. She tried Daddy, then George, but the breathing continued, steady and calm. Finally, she asked, "Who are you?" The breathing stopped completely. The silence was more terrifying than the sounds. When morning came, Peppa found her family having breakfast as if nothing happened. They laughed and talked as usual, but their voices sounded exactly like those from behind the walls. When she asked about the previous evening, they looked confused and said they'd gone to bed early. Throughout the day, Peppa heard the same footsteps, always invisible, always following the same path. Sometimes she'd turn a corner expecting to see someone, but the hallway was empty. The footsteps had become part of the house itself, a sound that never stopped. That night, Peppa realized the footsteps didn't match her family's routine. They followed a pattern established long ago, before she was born, when someone else lived in this house. Someone who was still walking through the rooms, still going about their daily life, completely unaware that anyone else was there. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. Peppa was helping Mummy Pig water the plants in the garden, but the flowers seemed to wilt and turn black as soon as the water touched them. The vibrant green leaves shriveled, and the colorful petals curled inward, revealing thorny, twisted stems. The soil beneath their feet began to crack and crumble, revealing not earth, but a dark, pulsating mass. A low, rhythmic thumping sound emanated from deep within the ground, like a giant heart beating. The air grew heavy with the scent of decay and something sweet, yet sickly. The familiar garden gnomes, usually so cheerful, now had vacant, staring eyes, their painted smiles frozen in a grotesque rictus. The garden, once a place of beauty and life, was transforming into a barren wasteland. The thumping grew louder, and the ground beneath them trembled. Dark, thorny vines erupted from the cracked earth, snaking their way around the wilting plants, their thorns dripping with a viscous, black liquid. The sun, usually so bright, was obscured by a thick, unnatural mist that rolled in from the edges of the garden. The sound of buzzing insects filled the air, but these were not ordinary bees. They were large, black, and their wings beat with an ominous hum. The garden shed, usually a place for tools, now seemed to pulse with an internal, sickly green light. The plants, once their friends, were now turning against them, their thorny branches reaching out like grasping claws. The garden was no longer a place of growth, but of consumption, slowly devouring everything in its path. The thumping intensified, and a large, dark maw opened in the center of the garden, revealing rows of jagged, crystalline teeth. The house, their home, felt miles away, and the garden had become a living, breathing nightmare. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. Peppa was playing with her toy train set in the living room. The train, usually so cheerful, began to make strange, clanking noises, and its lights flickered erratically. She tried to stop it, but it sped up, circling the room faster and faster, leaving a trail of dark, oily smoke. The smoke filled the room, making it hard to see, and the clanking grew louder, more menacing. The train cars transformed, their windows becoming empty, staring eyes, and their wheels grinding like teeth. Pause 30 seconds. Peppa stumbled back, her heart pounding. The train was no longer a toy, but a monstrous entity, chasing her around the room. She could hear faint whispers coming from the train, calling her name, inviting her to join its endless journey. The room grew colder, and the shadows danced around her, making the distorted train seem to come alive. She closed her eyes, wishing it was all a dream, but the cold touch on her cheek told her it was terrifyingly real. Pause 30 seconds. When she opened them again, the train was gone, but the tracks were etched into the floor, glowing with an eerie green light. She knew she was trapped. The house creaked and groaned around her, each sound a chilling reminder of the presence lurking within. She could hear faint whispers, carried on the wind, calling her name. The air grew heavy, and a strange, sweet smell filled the room, making her dizzy. She felt a cold touch on her ankle, and a shiver ran down her spine. Peppa knew she wasn't alone. Pause 30 seconds. The shadows in her room seemed to deepen, twisting into grotesque shapes. She could feel eyes watching her from every corner. The house was no longer a safe haven, but a trap. She pulled the covers over her head, but the whispers grew louder, more insistent. She knew she had to escape, but where could she go? The house was alive and it wanted her. She could hear the floorboards groaning, the walls creaking, as if the house itself was closing in on her. The air was thick with an unseen presence, and she felt a suffocating weight on her chest. Peppa knew this was the end. The last thing she saw before darkness consumed her was the glowing green tracks, leading into an abyss. And then nothing, just the silence of the house, waiting for its next victim. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. Peppa's playroom had always been her favorite place in the house, filled with colorful toys and games that brought her joy. But tonight, as she entered to retrieve a forgotten book, the room felt different. All of her toys were arranged in a perfect circle in the center of the room, facing inward as if they were having a meeting. The toy telephone was off its hook, emitting a soft dial tone that filled the room with an eerie hum. Her stuffed animals sat upright with their button eyes all turned toward the same spot, the empty space in the center of their circle. As Peppa watched, the toys began to move closer together, tightening their circle with small, jerky movements. The toy piano began to play a melody by itself, its keys depressing with invisible fingers, creating a tune that sounded almost familiar but wrong, like a lullaby played backwards. Her building blocks started to stack themselves into towers that defied gravity, balancing in impossible configurations that should have fallen but didn't. The jack-in-the-box began to turn its handle slowly, the tinny music playing at half speed, creating an ominous countdown to something terrible. Peppa tried to leave the room, but the door slammed shut behind her with a force that shook the walls. The toys all turned to look at her simultaneously, their painted faces seeming more alive than they had any right to be. The stuffed animals' button eyes began to glow with a soft, sickly light, and their stitched mouths appeared to move as if they were trying to speak. The jack-in-the-box finally popped open, but instead of the usual clown, a tiny figure that looked exactly like Peppa emerged, its face twisted into an expression of pure terror. The toy Peppa pointed at the real Peppa and opened its mouth in a silent scream, and all the other toys began to move toward her, their movements becoming more fluid and lifelike with each step. The room filled with the sound of mechanical laughter, growing louder and more distorted until it became a cacophony of madness that seemed to come from the toys themselves.